بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب رب العالمين أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Brothers and sisters, distinguished guests, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so we started last week talking about the intergenerational gap. So maybe we can just refresh our memories with a bit of interactive participation. Who would like to kick it off? What did we talk about last week? What is the intergenerational gap? David?
I remember we discussed adaptation, assimilation, acculturation, these kinds of processes of change when you go to a new culture, and how a lot of the parents from people here might have been gone through those processes, whereas the younger generation might have been born here and not had to. So they'd be.
Yep, that's right. Would anyone like to add to that?
Yes, Mustafa.
Also how the children and parents disagree with different things depending on the situation.
Okay, that's really good. So the definition that we spoke about last week, I know that some of us weren't really happy with this definition. It's the idea that age creates a barrier or barriers relating to levels of social interaction and compatibility at a personal level and at an emotional level. So that's the intergenerational gap. We said last week that the intergenerational gap, can sometimes lead to conflict. And this is what we spoke about last week. Hence the term intergenerational conflict. Okay, so we said last week that most sociologists, psychologists and anthropologists agree that the intergenerational conflict or intergenerational gap is a real problem. It's well documented, and there's been a lot of research on this topic. And last week I used the example of the Iraqi community. We used that as a mini kind of case study, and I lived that. I'm from an Iraqi background, and I remember when the first wave of Iraqi migrants started to move to this country, and the problems that they encountered. But we'll get into that a bit later as well. Okay, so if you remember last week, we spoke about a sociologist named Trevor Hogan. So Trevor Hogan says that the best example of the intergenerational conflict is demonstrated in the parent-child relationship. And then he goes on to say that the conflict is a byproduct of a child's failure to acknowledge or accept the authority of the parent. And we dismissed this last week, didn't we? We kind of shut it down. But I think there is some substance to what the professor is saying here. His choice of words is somewhat questionable, but I think there definitely is some substance to what he's saying. Bridging the intergenerational gap is a two-way street. An effort must be made on the part of the child and of the parent to help bridge the gap. Having said that, I think that the onus is on the child or on the young adult to initiate the process. How do people feel about this?
Why do you think that the onus is on the child?
I think that the young people, depending on how young we are, probably have more ability to initiate that process. I think there's more chance of us being able to, because we're not sort of in that process of maybe culture shock or maybe feeling a bit ill at ease ourselves. We're in our element. It's probably easier for us.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting take. Anyone else like to give their take?
Well, why couldn't it be from the parent? Because the parent's meant to be have more life experience, meant to be wiser, and meant to have the foresight to see that, hold on, my child is going through something a little bit different that I'm going through.
Yeah.
So shouldn't I initiate something to find the common ground so I don't lose my child in the process?
That's interesting. maybe one of the parents here would like to answer that question.
I guess there is a mutual agreement between the parents and the kids, because from the kids' side, because they started actually living here and they've got the experiences and also overcome the language, cultural barriers in this country.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, the parents also, they've got a good history, because themselves actually one day they were as adolescents and then started growing up, and they went through very complicated process, so they are aware what's going on with their own child.
Yeah.
So that giving them a good vision actually to start or take an initiative to start settle the conflicts with the kids.
Yeah, okay, that's excellent. It's really good. Okay, so going back to the talk that I'm giving today, or this short series yesterday and this last week and this week, the title is Intergenerational Conflict and Birrul Walidain, so honouring the parents. So I know that last week I didn't really go into honouring the parents and Birrul Walidain, so I'm going to do a bit of that now. So this is in answer to the question of Talib, why do you think the onus is on the children? So in the Quran, chapter 17, verse 23, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And your Lord enjoins that you should not worship but Him and be kind to the parents." This is an amazing ayah. Look at the association here being made between worshipping God and being kind to our parents. Kindness in this context, according to some interpretations, means obedience. But it doesn't just say worship God and be kind to your parents, does it? It says do not worship but God and be kind to your parents. Almost as if not being obedient to our parents means that perhaps we're committing some sort of shirk. Or that if we neglect our parents, then perhaps we're not even worshipping God in the true sense. Because we know that shirk comes in many forms. Not necessarily worshipping someone else, but giving preference to something else rather than worship. What Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq describes as shirk khafi. So I think this is a very, very interesting ayah. How do people feel about this?
Well, could we say that it might not be obedience to parents, it may be being good to parents, because there are other verses in the Quran that say, and if your parents call you to worship other than God, then, don't worship other than God, but be good to your parents.
Yeah. So that's very true. Thanks for that, though. So one of the instances where we're encouraged not to be obedient to our parents is if we're being forbidden from worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's one of the cases, probably an extreme case, probably not really relevant to any of us here, inshallah. But yeah, so the interpretations that I saw, I mean, a lot of them, you're right, a lot of them did kind of say goodness and kindness and that kind of thing, but some interpretations of that ayah, do not worship but God and be kind to the parents, kindness is interpreted as obedience.
Do we have any narrations or anything like that where we're told to interpret kindness as obedience? Or is that just speculation?
I guess it's different for every, I mean, the word can change according to its context. So, bless you. So there really isn't, to my knowledge, a particular hadith or a riwayah based on that word in isolation, but the interpretation or the tafsir of this ayah that I looked at, it was kind of alluding to the kindness being an obedience kind of thing.
Okay, but Ayman, the word in Arabic in the verse is ihsan, right?
Ahsan, yeah.
That comes from the word hasan, which is good.
That's right.
Good.
So how can that allude to?
That's a very good point. Yeah.
I think that it's being interpreted that way because in a cultural text, there's this association between. There's a sort of preconceived idea of this child-parent relationship being one that involves obedience because of cultural tradition and things like that.
Yep.
And so therefore I think it would be very easy for people to assume that there must be something that says obedience.
So you're saying that the obedience perhaps comes before the kindness, so it's kind of an unspoken assumption that people are already obedient to their parents. So the kindness is kind of complementary to that? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that that the Quran says kindness or goodness, and that people are assuming that there has to be somewhere where it says obedience, and they're looking for that without it necessarily being there.
Okay, that's interesting.
I think it's the verb before it, waqaba, it's this verb which makes a difference. Qada means this is ordained, this is the, when we say ordained, it's not just like an order for this life, this is the system. And he put only two things. First is to be abd, and second, to be good. So this gathering between these two maqams is from qada. It's what made this mufassir to bring it to that level.
Yeah.
So this is, I mean, how would kindness, in our understanding of kindness without any culture, understanding just for the word of kind, to be similar to abd? We have to think about it. So really, that kindness means when you want to be kind to somebody, it means that you will not hurt their feeling or anything. And this really comes to obeying.
Okay. Sallallahu We might leave the tafsir of that ayah to Sayyid Ahmed al-Hakim, or who I like to call Sayyid Quran al-Hakim, because I'm a bit out of my depth here. It's not really my forte. So, but thanks for that, Doctor. I think that sheds a bit more light on it. There's an interesting hadith that I found. A companion of Ahlul Bayt, Ibrahim bin Shu'ayb, narrates a conversation between himself and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Ibrahim says to the Imam, "My father is very old, so much so that we have to take him to the toilet." To which the Imam says, if you can help him with this, then do so. And feed him with your hands, for surely this will be your shield from the hellfire. It's a very, very strong hadith, isn't it? There's some very strong language there. So that's also alluding to this kind of relationship between worship and obedience. Worshipping God and being obedient to your parents. And there are so many more of these types. There's a lot that we can learn from the Western world in terms of social harmony, in terms of societal cohesion. Sheikh Ahmed al-Wa'ili, rahimahullah, once said, "I went to the West and I saw Islam in practice, but no practicing Muslims." That's very interesting, isn't it? So, if you actually look at parts of some of the legal constitutions in the West, there are some things, there are some comparisons, some correlation that you can draw between Islamic theology or Islamic jurisprudence and some of the things that are practiced here. Some are blatantly, obviously, completely, opposite to what we believe and what we practice, but there is definitely some substance there. Having said that, the elderly in the West generally become the responsibility of the state and not of their families, don't they? So, there's this kind of idea that when people become older, when people's parents become older, they, in this country, in a lot of the Western countries, what happens is they have these retirement villages or they have these old people homes, and they become the responsibility of the government, no longer the responsibility of their children. And that's very unfortunate. I find it difficult to imagine how a parent can one day become a burden for someone. It's really inconceivable to think how that can happen. But we'll move on for that. I'm sorry for being critical of the West.
That's a really good example of that, because if we were being obedient to our parents, we'd put them in a retirement home because that's what they demand of us. But if we were being kind to them, we'd look after them ourselves.
Okay, that's very interesting. What do people think about this?
I've had this conversation with many people
Yeah.
on the work site about retirement homes, and they say, why should they do see it as a burden. They say, I don't know how to take care of an old person. I don't know how to take them to the bathroom, clean them, and all these things like that. So why should I do it if there's someone there who can look after them?
Yeah, but it's funny. Our parents were never taught to bathe us and feed us and take care of us. So we were never a burden for our parents. So why should they be a burden for us?
Yeah.
So,
Is it that they're a burden, or is it that they want to have a professional looking after them because they feel that they're going to do a better job, that they're going to be there for them the whole time instead of going off to work and then coming back, and they stay alive a lot longer under that system?
Yeah, well,
Some retirement homes.
the son or daughter taking care of his parents means a lot.
yeah, absolutely. It does. That's right.
Means a lot than somebody else doing their job.
Of course.
And if they're using those services, does it necessarily mean that the son or the daughter isn't playing an active part in their care? Not necessarily. Often the son or the daughter is taking a very active part in their care and caring for them outside of working hours, going and being with them, but then going off to work so that they can raise the vast amount of money they need to pay for the retirement home.
I would imagine
Really expensive.
I would imagine if that's what they want, it's part of obedience to do it for them. I mean, you need to ask them what they want.
I asked my parents this actually, and they said they would feel very, ashamed to have a member of their own family doing that, seeing them in that state, and they want to be able to present themselves as strong and clean and all of these things to their children, so that their children still respect them, still look up to them.
Do you think we have this difference in idea because in our home countries there's no such thing as retirement homes?
It's cultural, isn't
So
it?
you don't
No,
face
there
that
is.
choice.
There
Yeah.
are. There are some retirement homes and old folks homes. Yeah.
I guess the physical attachment is very important then to develop the emotional attachment. So if we're getting back to the kids themselves within their own childhood, when they were infants, actually, the physical attachment, this is scientifically actually proved. And they said it's very important, for example, to touch the child, feeding the child, because that just create kind of the association between the parents and kids. Once the parents getting older, still the physical attachment is very important for them as kids. So they need it at the end. That's why sometimes they feel a bit vulnerable, hurt when their kids, for example, throwing them on the retire.
I think this is like if you remember last week I made the point that Australia for the most part is it's kind of a liberal place, a secular place to some extent, whereas back home it's a bit more conservative. Back in the Middle East it's a bit more conservative, and this is where the cultural difference is. Some things in this country may be encouraged, where the same thing in the Middle East perhaps might be frowned upon, and this is something I think that falls into that kind of context. If a family sent their parents to a nursing home, whether it be the will of the parents, whether that's what they wanted or not, that will be really kind of frowned upon socially in the Middle East. It's not really something that's that's practiced very often. So, but it's a matter of preference, I guess, and I think it's definitely cultural kind of thing.
Sorry, can I just put one thing in?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So if we say it's a cultural thing, where does the hadith from Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam come in? Where the young man is doing tawaf for his mum, he's carrying on her back, doing all the Hajj performances, and then he said, have her given her due, and he said, not even one rock of the cradle. So does that throw a religious context now into the discussion?
Oh, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
But what about if the parent doesn't want that?
What? Okay.
Because that was the whole.
That's what David is saying.
That's the whole thing about the culture. If I'm living in a culture where I don't want this, and you're saying no, you have to want it because this is religious. It's not religious. I think that the most important thing is respecting the will of the parents.
That's right.
And I think culturally, in our areas, let's say the Middle East, the parents want to live with their children
Yeah.
to the last day. So you have to respect that.
Mm.
If at one stage they don't want to, you have to respect that as well. So
But
There are people who leave their parents in a retirement home and don't spend time with them, which
Yeah.
I think it's disgusting.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a waste of their lives. But hiring a nurse to help look after someone doesn't mean that you're not going to carry them on your back and do time.
Mm. You want to say something about
Yeah, I was just going to say, you have to also keep in mind that even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the development of mankind, of a human being, is that they start off with their intellect very, very small, and they develop to, you know, a full-grown human with a strong intellect, and then they deteriorate again.
Mm-hmm.
So their intellect becomes as they were when they were a child. So just submitting to what they want as well could be problematic, because they don't know what's best for them at times.
Mm.
You have to kind of, you know, sometimes parents will say, I don't want my medicine. Do you submit to their will, or do you do what's best for them? So I think it's a bit more complicated than just following what they say as well.
Mm.
So Ahmed, how would you oppose that if the parents say, I don't want medication?
I actually don't have a solution.
that's how we should myself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's not so
Yeah,
simple.
No, it's not that simple.
I think something as well that's missing from this discussion is there are childless elders, there are parents who have lost their children, so they don't have someone looking after them.
Mhm.
And I think that as Muslims in this society, we need to make sure that there is a place for those people,
Mhm.
even if they don't have children to look after them. So just in this last week, I actually read about an aged care facility in Sydney that's opening, a Rahma facility, for those elderly
Yeah.
who don't have someone to look after them.
Mm.
So it would be wonderful if, people can come together as well, and for those people who need them,
Yeah.
something like that would exist as well in Melbourne.
Very good point. Very excellent point. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, that's a very good point. But I think in this discussion we're focusing more on the child-parent kind of relationship, and you know, the implications associated with the aged care facilities and those kind of things. But that's a very good point. You know, the elders without offspring or without anyone to take care of them, whose responsibility are they? That's a big problem. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq narrates a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, where a man asked the Prophet 4 times, to whom should I perform a good deed? 3 times the Prophet answered, your mother. When he was asked the 4th time, he said, your father. So there's a lot of there are a lot of ahadith and riwayat that point to this, taking care of the parent and making sure that we don't neglect our parents, because it's as Hajj Abu Zainab just mentioned before, it's a connection kind of thing, and it's a scientifically proven fact that, you know, the parent-child connection is it's one of the strongest bonds that it's really even difficult to put into words. As we mentioned last week, research shows that intergenerational conflict is a problem in all communities, but as we've already said, in communities of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, the problem is amplified. So, what, David, you're really on the ball with this, what's integration? Just refresh our memories.
Sorry, let me think. Integration. Coming together and becoming part of something.
Okay, so the best way that I like to think of it is a balance. A balance between, let's say, our culture and our heritage for people who've migrated, and, the society now that we call our own. Finding the best kind of balance. And it kind of, I'm oversimplifying it, but it's a really, really difficult kind of process. Many communities have encountered these kind of problems. Last week we said that the Greek community, when they came to this country in the mid-50s and early 60s, they encountered a problem that researchers and sociologists call culture freeze. So they were in this state of a frozen kind of culture where their traditions from overseas were enforced and emphasized here more strongly than they were at home. And given that the Greek population here in Melbourne is the largest, second only to Athens, you can imagine how big that would have been, how big of a problem that would have been back in the day. So integration is this balance, a balance between the culture that you left behind or your heritage and the culture that you've called your own more recently. And there's no real kind of blueprint, there's no real set kind of theory or guidelines that you can follow to make sure that you do go through this process. And it's a problem that that many of us still kind of coming to terms with. Okay, so we said last week that when the Shia Iraqi community first started to migrate to this country, many of them found it difficult to integrate. Many of them did integrate and went on to do great things. I want to emphasize this point. I'm not generalizing here. Others were never able to integrate and are somewhat still kind of detached from the rest of society. Most of the failure to integrate, in my opinion, stems from conservatism. Sometimes this conservatism is amplified upon migration. It's not a conscious decision, not at all. It's a natural defense mechanism against fear of change. So people don't like to move out of their comfort zone. People don't like to substitute something that they know well with something that they don't know well. It's a natural kind of course of action. صلى على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. Okay, so parents who find it difficult to integrate or difficult to adapt, they will be the ones who encounter the most difficulty in terms of an intergenerational problem with their children. Because as we said last week, their children will fit in, It won't really take that much time, really depending on age. But if the children come here young and they go through the schooling system from a very young age, then they would integrate because they spend most of their time in the school rather than at home. So it's a natural kind of thing. So the parents who find it difficult to integrate and difficult to adapt, they're the ones who are going to really be experiencing the most problems in terms of the intergenerational conflict. Okay. Surah Al-Hujurat, Ayah 13. I'm sure many of us know this ayah very well. We have created you from man and woman, tribes and ethnicities, so that you may know each other. Surely the one among you who is most honorable with Allah is that whom is most careful with his duties. Surely Allah is most knowing and aware. I don't know about you guys, but this, in my opinion, has got integration and social cohesion written all over it. It's really an ayah about understanding who the other person is, understanding the differences, accepting the differences, and perhaps embracing those differences. It's an ayah about tolerance. But Ahmed can tell us more about that maybe later. Okay, so we had a bit of a role play last week, and I think it went well. I think it was entertaining and it was informative as well. So I've prepared something this week as well. Is Ayla here?
I'm here.
Okay. You want to be one of the...
Oh, sure.
Alright. Do you want to choose a partner?
Maryam.
Excellent. Tafadhal. صلى على محمد
اللهم صل على محمد.
So halfway through the role play, if you notice there's an asterisk and there's a note saying that wait for me to give direction. There's just a couple of things I'd like to say before the end of it, so I'll kind of stop you halfway. But whenever you're ready. Okay, so my name's the parent and Ayla is the child. Whenever you're ready.
I traveled halfway across the world and left everything behind in hope that you would have a brighter future here. But you don't appreciate anything.
That's true. No, I'm just kidding. You cannot use your decision to migrate against me. Just because we are here now, it doesn't mean that I should become a doctor or a professor.
You are careless and disobedient, and I'm sick of it.
Why? Because I have an opinion and because I have my own emotions? Ambitions?
Notice here there's a clear disconnect. The parent and the child are on two completely different wavelengths. The parent feels hurt, let down and disappointed, while the child is merely being an individual, which is an ideology pushed so strongly in this country. It's coming across as rebellious to the parent though, and this sets a very dangerous tone and precedent for future disputes. Please continue.
What are they even teaching you at school? I don't even know who you are anymore.
You know what? I'm tired of you making me feel like I don't measure up. Just leave me alone.
Who do you think you are? Do you know what I went through for you?
Yeah. I've heard it all before, a million times. It's really getting old, Mum.
I don't like your tone. You need to remember who you're talking to.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Sallallahu Muhammad wa alihi. Okay, so it tells an interesting story, doesn't it? And these kind of disputes and discussions and arguments, if you will, go on very regularly in our communities and in our homes. And it's a real problem. And we need to find out what we need to do about it. Because, it's us with our parents, it's us with our children, So the problem of, finding commonality, finding balance, finding common ground between, the different generations, the age gap, it's going to be a problem, an ongoing problem for all communities and for everyone. Imam Ali alayhi salam says, do not force your own customs on your children because they are in other times than yours. This is very interesting, isn't it? That kind of integration kind of thing, it's really emphasized again. There are some people that are really critical of religion and say, it's not really relevant anymore. But the ayat that we've spoken about today, the riwayat that we've spoken about today, show that, these kind of things, they're real kind of sociological problems that we encounter today were, anticipated all those years ago. And this is where the discussion of perhaps al-Ghaib comes in, that the Imams and the Prophets are all knowing of future events, past events and present events. But, so the Imam here is saying don't force your own customs, don't force your culture on your children because they're in other times. As the times change, the culture should as well, regardless of where you are. We haven't even spoken about migration. The Imam hasn't spoken about migration. He's just saying that just because you're born with something doesn't mean that your child should be born with it as well. Just because you're taught something doesn't mean your child needs to be taught it. What do people think about this?
Maybe children are not necessarily ready for a particular lesson at the particular time when you feel like giving it.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there will come a time when they're ready and they want to even ask you, but it's just that it might not be in their zone of proximal learning.
Okay, interesting take. So maybe it's an issue of time, maybe the child is not quite ready, maybe they're still young and malleable and that kind of thing. So any other takes on that?
What was the question?
So the Imam, I can scroll to find it, but basically the Imam says don't force your customs or your culture on your children because they are in different times than yours.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this statement?
I think one thing that I think we all need to recognize as parents and as children is there's a difference between religion and culture. And I know it's an intertwined two entities, but there is a difference between what religion teaches you and what cultural behaviors that you perform in Iraq, in Australia, or anywhere in the world. And I think because of the mixing between the two, sometimes, especially for the parents, thinking that if you change the culture, you're actually changing things that are religious. Whereas sometimes it's just, religion can stay as it is, but you're changing cultural behaviors. And I think this is what the Imam is trying to point to, is that religion will stay. I don't think the Imam will say, teach them a different religion. Or
No, of course.
Exactly, but the culture can change.
The key word is customs that
exactly.
In the translation of
exactly.
the hadith.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Imam doesn't mention migration, but if we're talking about that here, we're talking about when people kind of migrate, you know, can they integrate quickly enough? So if we try to put the hadith in that kind of context, if we put it in practical sociological immigration kind of context for the intergenerational conflict, for those purposes, I think that the parents owe it to their children to integrate, to try to fit in. You know, how many parents take their you know, to take their kids to you know, a sports training match or something? If they're in a sports club, do they take them to training? Do they go watch them play? How many of them go with their kids to, you know, for example, the MCG? Do they do, you know, regular recreational kind of activities? You know, things that are really common in this country. You know, the local culture. I think maybe that's where perhaps, you know, the older generation lacks and should try to adapt. Would anyone like to add to that? Or maybe,
I just got a comment on that. It's interesting that you bring that example up, because I'm not a parent, but as a parent I can already imagine them saying that us integrating into such activities and us being brought up here, we've seen that many of our cultures that we've got in Australia conflict with our religion. So for example, going to the MCG used to be fun until I realised that's beer being thrown on me from behind. So, you know, there's a lot of integration that we can throw on the parents, but they're not, the kids aren't at a stage for the parents to say, hang on, this is religiously not correct. So how do you balance the two when the parents know it's religiously not correct, but the child is too young to understand that there are boundaries in integration as well?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, the example of going to the MCG might be a bit kind of extreme, but, you know, going somewhere like maybe to watch the tennis, I know the tennis is a bit more civil than AFL perhaps.
Tennis is boring.
Yeah, you know, maybe going rock climbing or something like that, fishing, you know, just because I remember back in school, in primary school, when the kids used to do their show and tell, and this kid used to say I went bungee jumping with my dad, and the other kid used to say I went diving with my dad. And I was there just twiddling my thumbs like, are these blokes serious? Or, you know? I've never done that kind of stuff with my parents, you know, so...
My dad took me to الحسينية.
Well, there you go, you know, it's a really kind of different discussion, you know, we cried for 10 nights while the other kids, you know, were climbing rocks and... got smashed, yeah. Good one. So, I think any inroads made in the way of intergenerational conflict on the part of the parent will surely here, you know, help to ease the process. By the same token, any effort on the part of the child to understand and acknowledge, So by the same token, any effort on the part of the child to understand and acknowledge the guidance of the parents will in turn help to bridge the gap. So it's a two-way street. I think it's a two-way street. Obedience is very important, as we've already spoken about. You know, kind of making sure that we are kind to our parents, you know, that we're not rude to our parents and that kind of thing. But we also need to understand that our parents coming to this country, for those of us whose parents migrated here, is a really difficult kind of process of adapting and of integrating. So the best way, I think, is to kind of try to see things from the other person's point of view. For the parent to put themselves in the child's shoes and say, okay, this child's going to school, this is what the kids are telling them, this is what those kids are doing with their parents. And the child saying, you know, hold on, my parent went through a really rough time back home, they went through the trouble of trying to migrate, try to find a better life for me, so maybe I should, you know, try to meet them halfway as well. And it can be a hand-in-hand kind of process of you know, learning about each other and learning how to fit in and how to work with each other. I think that's the best way. But, I mean, we don't really have time to talk about what we can do, you know, in terms of, you know, perhaps an event that we can do, maybe forums or that kind of thing. You know, I'd really like to get some ideas, but I've been told that I only have 2 minutes, so unfortunately we can't really get into that right now. But I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and I'd like to thank you all for your participation over the past 2 weeks. It's been really great. آخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.